Hey guys, tonight we're traveling back to a time long before supermarkets, pharmacies, hot water bottles, painkillers, and those tiny emergency tampons that somehow vanish from your bag exactly when you need them. We're going back thousands of years to explore a surprisingly universal human experience, one that affected queens, farmers, priestesses, merchants, servants, and just about every woman who ever lived. Tonight, we're asking a simple question. How did ancient women handle their periods? Before we settle into tonight's journey, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these slow explorations. And while you're down in the comments, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. There's something oddly comforting about knowing that while we're discussing Roman hygiene disasters, someone else is listening from a completely different corner of the world. So dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe put your phone face down for a little while, and let's gently wander into human history. Periods now. If you've ever wondered whether ancient women simply suffered with absolutely no solutions whatsoever, the answer is no. Human beings are remarkably creative when confronted with recurring problems. Sometimes that creativity produces modern medicine or soft cotton products, and sometimes it produces instructions involving moss, wool, papyrus, and enough superstition to power an entire medieval kingdom. As we drift back through time, one thing becomes clear. Ancient women were not passive victims of biology. They experimented, they adapted, and occasionally, they listened to advice that sounds absolutely ridiculous today. Human history would be much shorter if people consistently made sensible decisions. Let's begin in ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt often feels strangely modern compared to many societies that came after it. The Egyptians loved organization. They documented everything: taxes, crops, religious ceremonies. If somebody sneezed near a grain warehouse, there was probably a scribe ready to write it down. Because of this, Egypt gives us some of the earliest clues about how women managed menstruation. One commonly discussed possibility involves soft papyrus. Papyrus is usually remembered as a writing material, but the plant itself was versatile. Egyptians used it for ropes, baskets, and countless everyday items. Some historians believe strips of softened papyrus may have been fashioned into primitive menstrual products, not exactly luxurious, but perhaps surprisingly practical. Egyptian women also had access to linen, and linen was everywhere. Clothing, household goods, bandages, medical supplies. When life gives you endless quantities of linen, eventually someone is going to use it to solve a recurring monthly problem. And that's what happened. The wealthy likely had more comfortable options. The poor likely reused cloth repeatedly, which remained normal for most of history until very recently. Ancient people were not stupid. They lacked modern technology. When faced with a practical challenge, most people eventually develop practical solutions. Now let's slowly float eastward. Ancient Mesopotamia gives us fewer direct details. Unfortunately, many historical records focus heavily on kings. Kings fighting, kings building things, kings writing long inscriptions explaining how magnificent they were. History was essentially a social media feed for powerful men. Women's daily experiences often appear only in fragments. Yet those fragments tell us something important. Menstruation was connected with ideas about ritual purity. This meant that monthly bleeding was often treated not simply as a biological event, but as a social and religious condition. Different communities had different rules. As with many aspects of history, reality was likely more complicated than surviving texts suggest. Real life tends to win most arguments. Now let's wander over to ancient Greece. The Greeks had opinions about everything: philosophy, politics, sports, ethics, the ideal shape of a nose. Greek medical theories often revolved around balancing bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Menstruation was frequently viewed as the body's way of maintaining balance. Some physicians believed menstrual blood removed excess material. One Greek physician could propose a theory based on almost nothing. Another would disagree. A third would invent an even stranger explanation. As for practical management, cloth remained the most likely solution. Soft fabrics could be folded and reused. Simple, effective, not glamorous. Speaking of boring solutions, let's visit ancient Rome. The Romans loved systems: road systems, tax systems, legal systems, military systems. Roman women likely relied heavily on cloth materials. Wool was common. Linen was common. Textiles were woven throughout daily life. Roman writers described menstruation in ways that range from mildly odd to completely unhinged. One claimed menstrual blood could damage crops. Imagine waking up and discovering your monthly cycle has been blamed for a failed harvest. Ancient women did not need responsibility for regional weather patterns. When knowledge is limited, myths rush in to fill the gaps. Sometimes they survive for centuries, and sometimes they sound very strange today. As our evening journey continues, we'll discover that nearly every civilization developed its own mixture of solutions, theories, and spectacular misunderstandings, because periods were universal, but explanations rarely were. Humanity has always excelled at creating complicated answers. So settle in. We're only getting started. Now that we've wandered through Egypt, Greece, and Rome, it's time to drift a little further east, where different civilizations were forming their own explanations for the same monthly reality. And as always, they didn't agree on much. Ancient India offers one of the oldest surviving bodies of medical thought in the world, and menstruation appears in it in a mix of practicality. In early Ayurvedic thinking, the body was understood through balance, not too different in spirit from Greek theories, just with different vocabulary. Health was a matter of harmony between internal forces, and anything that disrupted that balance naturally became something to manage carefully. Menstruation was recognized as a normal biological process, but also one that required a degree of separation from certain activities. Texts describe temporary restrictions around ritual spaces, not necessarily because menstruation was seen as bad, but because it didn't align with ritual purity. In practice, this likely meant something very human and very familiar: a pause, a break from certain expectations, because ancient life rarely offered clarity. It offered rules that were followed strictly in some places and loosely in others, depending on who was watching. And of course, alongside the cultural and religious interpretations, there were the practical realities. Cloth again appears as the most likely material used, simple and reusable, washed and returned to service, in a cycle that feels almost poetic. Water, however, was not always as accessible or as clean as we might assume today. So, washing and reusing wasn't just a routine. It was an entire system of care, maintenance, and adaptation to environment. Now, if we slowly drift further east again, we arrive in ancient China, where medical thinking developed along its own path. Traditional Chinese medical thought often described health in terms of energy and circulation, deeply influenced by ideas of balance, flow, and internal harmony. Within that framework, menstruation was understood as a natural and necessary release, tied closely to the body's overall rhythm. Practical approaches would have varied widely depending on region and class, but cloth remains the most consistent and historically supported assumption. What's interesting here is not just what people used, but how consistently humans everywhere arrived at similar solutions without communicating across continents. Soft fabric, washable material, reusable care, different cultures, same conclusion. Because when you remove modern technology from the equation, human ingenuity tends to converge on whatever works with what is available. And while all of this was happening, layered over it in almost every ancient society was something else entirely: belief. Menstruation, across many societies, became surrounded by ideas of purity, separation, and timing. Some of these ideas were gentle and practical, others were more restrictive, and some, frankly, became so layered with symbolism that it's hard to tell where observation ended and storytelling began. In some communities, menstrual blood was treated as powerful, but requiring distance. In others, it was simply a private matter, and in all cases, the lived experience of women likely sat somewhere between official rules and real life, because rules in ancient societies often had a flexible relationship with daily reality. A rule might exist in writing, but implementation depended on practicality. Now, let's gently step back and look at the broader picture. Across Egypt, Greece, Rome, India, and China, something becomes clear. There was no single ancient understanding of menstruation. There were many, some medical, some symbolic, some practical, and all of them trying, in their own way, to explain something that was universal but not always openly discussed. Which brings us to one of the quieter truths. Most women likely learned what they needed through experience rather than formal instruction, from older relatives, from observation, from trial and error. Knowledge moved through households, not institutions, and that meant solutions were often local, personal, and quietly shared. No manuals, no official guides, just lived experience passed down. Not just how people managed menstruation, but how consistently human life adapts around recurring needs. It is one of those quiet constants of history. People figure things out, not perfectly, not uniformly, but persistently. In the next part, we'll move into the medieval world, where religious interpretation grows stronger, and the gap between belief and biology becomes even more interesting. So stay comfortable. We're just slowly getting deeper into the story. As we drift into the medieval world, things begin to feel a little more structured, and at the same time, a little more complicated. Societies are larger now. Religious institutions are stronger. Written rules are more common. And yet, daily life is still powered by the same basic human reality we've been following all along. People still need to eat. They still need to work. And yes, bodies still do what bodies have always done, regardless of how many rules get written about it. In medieval Europe, menstruation was often viewed through a deeply religious lens, not always in a negative way, but certainly in a way that tied the body to ideas of purity, cleanliness, and sacred space. This meant that in some communities, menstruation came with temporary restrictions around participation in religious rituals, not necessarily because it was seen as something dangerous in itself, but because medieval thinking often categorized bodily states into appropriate and inappropriate contexts. In everyday life, however, things were much more practical than the written rules might suggest, because medieval households were not waiting for official instructions to deal with monthly realities. They already had systems, simple ones. Cloth, again, remains the most likely and widespread solution. Pieces of linen or wool fabric could be folded, reused, and washed. Laundry itself, of course, was not the quick modern task we know today. It was labor-intensive, time-consuming, and usually shared among women in the household or community. It was part of a larger domestic rhythm of cleaning and maintaining resources. Now, if we slowly move beyond Europe and into the wider medieval world, we see similar patterns repeating in different cultural forms. In parts of the Islamic world, medical knowledge advanced significantly. Drawing on Greek, Persian, and Indian sources, physicians of the time often described menstruation as a natural bodily process tied to health and balance, with practical advice on hygiene. Medical writers frequently tried to treat menstruation as part of normal human physiology, rather than something mysterious or purely symbolic. Cloth-based solutions, adapted to climate, wealth, and availability, remained the most realistic approach across regions, across ancient and medieval civilizations. Despite differences in language or religion, the practical response to menstruation remained remarkably consistent, not because people were copying each other, but because they were solving the same problem with similar constraints. No mass production, no standardized supplies, no commercial industries, just fabric, water, time, and human adaptation. And yet, while the practical side stayed relatively stable, the cultural interpretations around menstruation continued to vary widely. In some societies, it was surrounded by ideas of sacred timing. In others, it was treated as a private, unremarkable part of life. Official ideas rarely describe the full reality. They describe a version of it, a structured one, a simplified one. Real life, meanwhile, continues quietly underneath, doing what it has always done. Now, as we gently move forward through time, we start approaching a period where change becomes more visible. The early modern world begins to shift production methods, household materials, and eventually medical understanding. But before that, there is still a long stretch of history where life remains deeply manual and local. So in the next part, we'll slowly enter the early modern period, where new materials and ideas begin to reshape old assumptions. And as always, beneath all of it, life continues its quiet monthly rhythm, unchanged, unbothered, and entirely indifferent to human theories about it. As we step into the early modern period, something subtle begins to shift. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in the quiet background of daily life. The world is slowly becoming more connected, and more industrial. The world is slightly more predictable in how goods are made and distributed. Households are still doing most things manually, but trade networks are expanding and cities are growing. New materials are gradually entering everyday life, and human biology remains exactly the same as it has always been. Monthly, unavoidable, completely indifferent to economic progress. In many parts of Europe, linen continues to be the most common fabric used for menstrual management. It is durable, washable, and already deeply integrated into household textiles. What starts to change is the availability of cleaner, more standardized fabric due to improved textile production. As weaving techniques improve, cloth becomes slightly more consistent in quality, which makes reuse and hygiene marginally easier to manage. It is not a revolution yet, more like a quiet upgrade that nobody formally announces. At the same time, medical understanding is also evolving, though still heavily influenced by older theories. The idea of bodily humors still lingers, meaning menstruation is often explained through concepts of balance and internal flow. Alongside those older frameworks, a more observational approach is slowly beginning to appear in medical writing. Doctors and surgeons increasingly rely on experience and observation, even if their interpretations are still shaped by outdated models. So you get this interesting overlap. Old explanations still exist. New observations are beginning to form, and both coexist in the same medical texts without much sense of contradiction. In everyday life, however, most women are not reading medical treatises. They are dealing with practical realities. Cloth remains the primary solution, sometimes folded, sometimes layered, sometimes carefully washed and reused. Because while medical theories evolve slowly, daily life prioritizes what works immediately over what is theoretically correct. Now, if we zoom out a little, something important becomes clearer across the entire historical timeline, from ancient Egypt to medieval Europe, China to Rome. The practical response to menstruation remains remarkably consistent. Human beings tend to solve recurring biological needs in ways that fit their environment and available materials. And yet, alongside this practical continuity, cultural interpretation keeps shifting. Sometimes menstruation is treated as sacred, sometimes as private, sometimes as medically neutral. But underneath all of it, the lived experience remains quietly persistent, a bodily rhythm that continues regardless of belief systems, social rules, or historical period. As we move further into the early modern era, we approach the edge of industrial change. New inventions and new ideas about hygiene begin to reshape how menstrual products are designed. But that transition does not happen all at once. It unfolds slowly across generations. We will see how the foundations of modern products start to appear long before they become common. A world still grounded in cloth, but quietly moving towards something new. As the world continues shifting into the industrial era, change finally starts to pick up speed, not in the sense that everything transforms overnight, but daily life begins to feel influenced by systems that exist outside the household. Factories are producing textiles at a scale that would have been unimaginable just a few centuries earlier. Cities are expanding, goods are traveling further, and slowly, the idea of standardized products begins to take shape. This matters more than it might seem. For most of history, menstrual care was dependent on what a household could make, wash, or repurpose. Now, for the first time, there is the beginning of something new: consistency, availability, and eventually, specialization. Early forms of commercial menstrual products begin to appear in industrialized societies, although they are not yet widespread or easily accessible. At first, many of these products are still variations of cloth-based solutions, designed with added layers, improved stitching, or more structured forms. They are not the disposable products we recognize today, but they represent an important shift in thinking. Someone, somewhere, is now designing products specifically for this purpose, intentionally creating items for menstrual management. At the same time, hygiene as a concept is also slowly evolving. Medical science develops further in the 18th and 19th centuries. The idea that cleanliness can directly impact health becomes more prominent, even if the mechanisms are not yet fully understood. This gradually influences how people think about menstruation as well, as a normal biological process that benefits from cleaner, more structured management. Still, access remains uneven. Industrial innovation does not instantly reach everyone. Urban centers tend to change faster. Rural areas often continue using traditional methods for much longer. Cloth-based solutions remain dominant for the majority of people, and this overlap creates an interesting moment in history. Old methods and new ideas existing side by side. Now moving forward, we approach the late 19th and early 20th centuries, where menstrual products begin to resemble something more familiar. Mass production becomes more efficient. Advertising begins to shape public awareness, and products become part of broader consumer culture. This is also where silence around menstruation starts to become more socially structured, more private, and more carefully discussed in public spaces, which creates its own kind of tension. On one hand, there is progress in design. On the other, there is still discomfort in open discussion. By the early 20th century, early versions of disposable pads begin to appear. They mark a significant turning point. From here, the path toward modern products becomes clearer. Improved materials, better absorbency, more comfortable designs. But even as technology advances, one thing remains unchanged: the basic human experience at the center of it all, handled, understood, and explained differently across every civilization, but always present. As we move into the final part of this series, we will step into the modern world, where science and personal experience intersect. A story that started with cloth and quiet improvisation is now entering an age of global awareness and adaptation.